Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. You're listening to Ixia Talks episode 13, Making Your Data Tell the Right Story, Analytics You Can Really Use. I'm Sydney Jones. I'll be your host today, and I'm the Head of Marketing Communications here at Ixiasoft. Ixia Talks is a webinar series that covers data, agile document management, localization, Ixiasoft's very own CCMS, and more. Episodes are released periodically and cover a wide range of topics in the TechCom industry. Before we get started, there are a few things that you should know. First off, this presentation is being recorded, and we will send you the link to the recorded version about an hour or so after it airs. You'll be able to share this with colleagues and friends who weren't able to make it today. Finally, if you would like to ask a question during the webinar, you can type this into the questions section of your control panel, and Matthew and I will answer these at the end of the presentation. So now on to the show. Our guest today, who is waiting in the wings, is Matthew Neu. Matthew, welcome to the show. We're very happy to have you as our guest.
Hello, Sydney. Thank you.
So where are you tuning in from, Matthew?
I'm in Milwaukee, where it is sort of a gray, trying to be spring day.
Right. It is the first day of spring, so that's good news. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit more about yourself?
Absolutely. Well, I like to describe myself as a dyed-in-the-wool analyst. I was looking at the world through an analytical lens long before I had a word for it, and I love the notion that I've been able to make a career out of it. I live and work in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I also sing in the Milwaukee Symphony Chorus. I started my journey doing graphic design and desktop publishing, migrated into process enhancement and report building for a major electronics distributor, before moving into the staffing industry, where I focused on business intelligence and analytics. As a process analyst, I help companies find ways to improve their existing business processes, which often involves training. As a business analyst, I dive into business data and produce actionable intelligence, observations and visualizations that business partners can use to drive stories and policies. Now, on paper, I've worked in different industries with distinct roles, but in reality, a common thread runs through it all: the ever-curious, creative analyst, looking for ways to work smarter, and a learner teacher, looking for interesting gems to dig up and share with others.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm sure that you will be revealing many interesting gems for us today. Just to go over the agenda quickly, so we've already done our introductions. Next up, Matthew will get into data hygiene, followed by data visualization, data integrity, and then some principles in action focused around readability. And as usual, we will wrap up with our Q&A. So Matthew, I will let you kick us off.
Thank you. Now, before I launch into this material, this is a presentation geared toward a general audience of business professionals. If you're a database analyst, business analyst, or similar data professional, you already know much of this, but this presentation may help you to explain these concepts to others. If you're not one of us, you may not regularly build datasets, create reports, or produce or deliver visualizations. On some levels, you're lucky, but at some point, we all have to touch data, so this message is still for you. As I walk through this presentation, let's just assume you're involved every step of the way. We have a lot of material to cover, but we will have some time at the end for questions and reflections. Ready? Let's begin. I'll go back one. What is data hygiene? Data hygiene is the general term for the practices and policies that keep your data clean, or to improve the cleanliness of data after the fact. Clean data is error-free, though we can debate the extent to which truly clean data actually exists. Most companies think of data hygiene as data cleanup, removing duplicate records, spell checking content, checking data fields against one another, and employing similar validation checks on content that's already out in the world. This is often referred to as data scrubbing. I'm not saying it's bad, but it is often not enough. Think of data hygiene like physical hygiene. You wash your hands, clean surfaces, cover your mouth when you cough or sneeze, and so on. You do these things because they make your world a little tidier, a little safer. They're good habits that you practice whether you see a compelling reason or not, because you never know when it might become important. With data, it's easy to proceed without taking the time to check for or engage in good data hygiene practices. I've seen coworkers pull reports they don't particularly understand, slice the data in ways they feel is right, and then present their findings to clients who go on to take real action without checking the accuracy or validity of the data, or taking steps to make sure they're not introducing errors in the process. And they're often surprised when their decisions don't produce the results they want. Business decisions rarely have the luxury of waiting until your data has been thoroughly cleaned. It's much better to practice good data hygiene along the way, taking steps to test and validate your data periodically as you go, so you don't have to take a sick day to clean up your data when you really need it. Identifying the quality of your data, doing what you can to filter out impurities, and making sure your actions don't introduce more impurities or ambiguities. All of these are steps to take early and often. Now, who is responsible for data hygiene? In short, everyone. Everyone who touches data has a role to play. In the data architecture phase, how you build a database or dataset can make data validation and maintenance easier. Building to the right scope, scale, and requirements, and accurately anticipating future use make it easier for users to practice good data hygiene. In the data entry phase, speed and accuracy are key. But businesses often forget to test that accuracy and provide feedback loops to encourage it. In the maintenance phase, editing should be easy, straightforward, and preferably employ some sort of audit trail. Careless or misinformed maintenance can quickly render a dataset useless. If data hygiene is not proactive, all the work falls onto the shoulders of the maintenance team. In the report building phase, report architects need to understand the structure of the data they're working with and have some idea of expected output. The less they know about the data, the more they have to rely on fact-checking with other business partners, so they don't inadvertently introduce or fail to detect errors. In the report consumption phase, analysts and users manipulate reports to produce their numbers or visualizations. This is the last chance to detect data issues, but since it's so many steps since data generation, it is a particularly challenging moment to correct them. By the time we enter the presentation phase, our data is out in the world, and it is often in a form that makes testing and validation very difficult and backtracing issues almost impossible. Still, if you are presenting or delivering content and something gives you pause, it's worth asking questions. Good data hygiene is all about establishing guardrails on your data. Those rails will be tested, and they will almost certainly fail eventually. The more distributed and consistent your data hygiene, the better your business will be at detecting and correcting for errors that emerge. It is important to recognize that good data hygiene is never done. If you touch it, then hygiene is important. Ignorance is no protection. You need to challenge your data, at least a small test, and preferably something a little bit more vigorous. The better you are at challenging your data, the more likely it is to withstand future challenges. Often, it's not enough simply to obtain data. You have to interpret data in a visualization, a table, chart, map, or diagram. When it comes to visualizations, you want your data as clean as possible, but you still need to test it. That's just good data hygiene. As you look over your data, you might use pivot tables or pull it into an application like Tableau or Power BI and start exploring your data. Instinct is a fine starting point, but good data practice demands that we don't stop there. How will you challenge your instincts and existing biases? Depending on the structure and content of your data set, different kinds of visualizations make sense. When I'm learning a data set, I almost deliberately make ugly visualizations with way too much on the page because I want to see what anomalies might jump out so I can focus on those to see if they're signal or noise. That is a part of my standard data hygiene practice. If I just pulled top-level summaries, I wouldn't see those blips. If I didn't explore, I would miss alternative views of the data that might reveal interesting insights or issues. The more transparent you are with your data delivery, the more you can trust your process, and the more people will trust your observations. Now, most of the business world has access to Excel, and most of us are at least somewhat familiar with it, so it's my go-to application for discussing visualizing data. I could easily spend an hour going through the different kinds of visualizations available in Excel and the decision tree that leads to each visualization. I've actually produced presentations like this on that exact topic. Ultimately, any single visualization larger than a single total breaks down into one of three categories: ratios, trending, and ratios over time, or trending ratios. Each has strengths and weaknesses. Displayed here are the icons for Excel 365's most likely used charts, sorted into these categories. Now we move on to ask, what makes a chart legible? That depends on a number of criteria. First, know your audience. Are you dealing with experts on your data or non-experts? Are they familiar with your business terms? Using the right terms for your audience is important. While using the right terms signals to your audience that you know your topic and their business, unfamiliar jargon will quickly turn your audience off and chase them away. Are they familiar with currency and other local qualities of your data? Different audiences may expect their content in US dollars or euros, or might expect their numbers formatted in their local custom. I used to do some reporting for a client team in India and had to quickly retool my graphics to not only show local currency, but to reflect their preferred number formatting. Perhaps most importantly, are there audience members with known preferences for data consumption? Does anyone have special needs like color blindness that could impact visualization? Once I even had a client who specifically always printed out any of the visualizations I provided. Once I realized that, I made a point of formatting everything so that it would not only show well on the screen, but also print meaningfully for her use. Also, to that point, consider how the visualizations will be consumed. A laptop, a large monitor, a projector or screen in the conference room, and a printout all have different capabilities, and your content may be illegible or suboptimal if output to a medium it was not designed for. All these considerations guide us along the sliding scale between detailed visualizations and streamlined dashboard type visualizations. When in doubt, always aim for a streamlined, minimalist visualization. Here we have two examples to underscore the legibility point. At left, we have a generic dashboard example. The designer resisted the urge to put numbers and labels all over the document. Visualizations like this are a fine starting point for analysis or telling a data story. In a case like this, I would often follow this up with more detailed visuals to elaborate or underscore particular points here. Now at right, we have what I would call a bad visualization. It also, to its credit, avoids the temptation to put numbers on everything. But with so many categories, it's incredibly hard to read, even if it's enlarged to make the text legible. The data can't tell its story clearly in this format. I spoke earlier about actionable intelligence. I almost never create charts and other visualizations for the fun of it. Almost. And none of us wants to produce content that will never be used. It is rarely enough for data to be interesting. It should also be useful. For business visualizations especially, look for an action or policy that your visualization should drive. Even if that's keep going, we're on the right track. Memorable content is elusive. It emerges from a combination of factors that are partly subjective. If exploring the data led you to an observation that raised an eyebrow, that's a good start. Team that with a streamlined visualization and concise explanation, and you're on your way to something memorable. Good layout and arrangement of visualizations and support text can make your content shine, especially if you've done your job with legibility and actionability. When in doubt, Find a proofreader with a passing familiarity with your subject and see how they react. Data integrity means content that is reliable and consistent. It doesn't look different on different days, and it makes sense from multiple vantage points. Low data integrity could be the result of manipulation or dishonest intent, but it's more likely the result of poor data hygiene, an error-prone process, or some other innocent flaw. Good data hygiene practices can reveal data integrity issues and may improve them over time. When analyzing your own data or consuming data someone else presents to you, it is incredibly important to understand our inherent biases. Chief among these from an analytic perspective is confirmation bias, the tendency for us to latch onto information that supports what we expect to see and discount information that does not. Confirmation bias is everywhere. It's just part of how we're all wired. But we can fight it by looking for counterfactuals. Try to prove a conflicting point with your data or look for ways to prove yourself wrong. It may be hard, but if you can do either of those, your data is too ambiguous to make the point you wanted to make, and you just overcame some of your confirmation bias. Unfortunately, not everyone checks their biases with counterfactuals, or they do, but not successfully. We are, after all, quite good at deceiving ourselves. That's where things like conspiracy theories arise from. Not all deceptive data practices are deliberate or malicious, but good data hygiene processes can help to identify these deceptions, or at least raise flags, provided you have enough access to information. In general, look for inconsistent or missing axes on charts, like dates or dollar values that are unevenly spaced. I even saw some of these in the news the other day. Comparing data sets with different sample sizes or collection methodologies, comparing apples to oranges, or visualizations that provide snappy views of data without the larger context. Ixiosoft has some documentation on readability. I do not pretend to be an expert on this subject, but I do find it fascinating. Legible, actionable, and memorable are not just good traits for your visualizations. They're also important for most other forms of content. The metrics you're probably most interested in are those around how your customers are consuming your documentation. For example, which pages are most frequently visited on your documentation website? Which pages are never visited at all? Knowing things like this enables you to investigate further to determine if seldom visited pages are simply difficult to find or if they're not actually helpful. You can use your findings to rewrite or reorganize topics to make them more usable or findable, or to deprecate them altogether if they're just not needed by your customers. Most dynamic publishing systems like Fluid Topics or Zoom-In offer their own analytics to help with this. Responsive web help also enables your customers to provide on-the-spot feedback to you while they're using the documentation. You can probably get good metrics from your support team as well. It could be something as simple as a list of the most frequently asked questions or the product areas that create the most support tickets. With this information, you can beef up your documentation in those areas and hopefully reduce some of those tickets. Readability metrics, while inherently imperfect, still provide us with the framework to understand the complexity and digestibility of your content. Furthermore, several websites have readability tests readily available for us to use on the fly, and that makes readability metrics ideal for today's purposes. One example of these readability metrics is the relatively familiar Flesch reading ease. It produces a score between 1 and 100, though many of the common metrics use smaller scales. They generally weigh word length, counting syllables, and sentence length, counting words, to produce their weighted grade. Of course, not all words of equal syllabic length or sentences of equal word length are of equal complexity, but all analysts understand this one truth: no metric is perfect. Not all content is equally valuable. Concise prose conveys an idea quickly and crisply, where incoherent prose rambles, bumbles, and meanders its way towards some ostensible point. Space may be limited, but attention almost certainly is. The more text your readers need to wade through, the less likely they are to make the journey. Do them a favor and keep your text as lucid as possible. In this example, we have a particularly pithy quote from Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad. "Some people are immune to good advice." That line immediately made me think of a few particularly advice-resistant colleagues I've known. I'm sure you can think of a few too. But we've all known people who just can't seem to get a point out if their lives depended on it. That's why it was fun for me to see how verbose I could make that simple 7-word sentence within the bounds of English grammar. I thought I did a pretty good job at inflating the text, especially considering that I trained myself to do the exact opposite. Feel free to try your hand later and see if you can beat this inflated sentence. We don't all agree on what makes actual text readable, and different readability measures are no different. While all the major readability metrics found the text on the left to be highly digestible, they disagreed on just how difficult the text on the right was to swallow. That's why readabilityformulas.com looks at 7 common readability metrics to find a consensus. I made a sample data set from some texts I had on hand, most of them of my own creation. I was particularly curious to see how my own content would rate and whether my efforts to speak in different voices would show up in the readability metrics. With a data set this small, there is only so much data exploration we can do. Maybe I'll revisit this in the future and see how much of my writing I can collect and analyze for readability. If this sort of project strikes you as interesting, congratulations, you're an analyst at heart. It's worth noting that even in small data sets like this, you should still look for counterfactuals and consider data hygiene. If you take these steps all the time, they become second nature, and your data is less likely to turn on you when you need it most. And yes, even though this was just a sample data set that I used for this presentation, I still thought about and spent time reflecting on what data hygiene practices I would employ. Here, I have a very simple visualization, a pivot table, averaging the readability metrics for each category I assigned. That was my starting point for my exploration. Now, what do I know about this little data set? I know it has timestamps, but those are just when I fed the content into the testing app. Not useful. Grouping by source is useful because I made sure to choose sources that mean something to me. That's an example of good data architecture. If I added more attributes like that, I would have more potential paths of analysis. I need to be careful with the different scales of these various metrics. That would be an easy way to veer into deceptive data practices. Since I don't have a meaningful time attribute in my data, I really only have one meaningful attribute, source. I'm stuck with visualizations that use ratios, so pie charts, bar charts, and stacked bars. Here we start at the top level before we drill into detail. We see that website has the largest sample size and expository writing the smallest. The larger the sample size, the more likely we are to have a representative sample, assuming our data acquisition team used good practices. Looking one level deeper, I chart my readability measures by source, keeping that pesky Flesch reading ease metric separate. If I were using this long term, I would develop a calculation based on that to fit it into the point scale of the rest of the measures so I could more easily compare them. Admittedly, these graphics are not the most elegant, but they are quick and concise. The legend only appears once on the page, and I added some horizontal lines on the right to keep my metrics clearly separated. I thought my poetry and creative writing would rate as less readable, and the rankings of particular texts surprised me. I would want to review the documentation on how those scores are calculated for the various metrics. In a business setting, I might consider favoring the metric or metrics that best reflected the apparent readability of my text. Or is that my confirmation bias talking? Overall, this was an intriguing case. Now I want to dig deeper on more texts and review the metrics. This is a fine rabbit hole to wander down some weekend afternoon. On this slide are a few helpful links on the topics covered today, and Sydney will send these links out after the call.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matthew. You've given our listeners lots of great information, and as we all know, analytics are important to any business, no matter what the industry. So I would now like to open up the floor for questions. Just a reminder that you can type these into your control panel right up until the end of the presentation. So we'll get started with the questions. And Matthew, our first question is, this is a lot of interesting theory, but how can I improve my data hygiene practices today?
Well, thank you, Sydney. Since we often don't have optimal control of our data processes, we wonder, where can I start? How can I work better? How can I work smarter? And what I say is almost all of us touch data every day, and we have to be able to identify where we have some kind of impact. Whether that's in a business setting or even at home, looking at my personal finances and trying to fact check. It's equivalent to balancing your checkbook. That's a data validation process. Everywhere you go, every data file that you touch, every time you look at a chart or other visualization, you have a chance to stop and question. And that questioning, that asking yourself, how can I tell whether this information is accurate, drives you toward better data hygiene practices. Personally, whenever I'm looking at a flat file or a relatively raw data source, if I'm going to transform that data, I want to make sure that I have some handle, whether that's the number of rows or some summary level, to make sure that I can say, does what I started with equate to what I ended with? Am I leaving anything out? Did I accidentally cut anything out that I didn't mean to cut out? And I also typically, if I'm looking at a big file like that, I'll take a quick scroll through the values in each of my fields just to see if there are any crazy outliers. I might even just regularly run a spell checker on a data set that I'm looking at before I go any further, because misspelled words and other formatting gaffes can introduce a lot of unnecessary error. And we like to think that what we make is perfect, but let's face it, it's not. And we are terribly inept at recognizing our own imperfection. Errors will creep into your process, and you just have to accept it and understand it without blame and recrimination. You just incorporate some good data hygiene practices, start figuring out some checksums or other sorts of validation that you can employ, small, simple steps. And then you have essentially become a proofreader on some level for all the data that you touch.
Thanks, Matthew. So our next question then is, you mentioned how to combat your own confirmation bias, but how can you address others' bias?
Calling out other people's bias is always a challenge. We naturally bristle at that kind of confrontation. One colleague of mine liked to describe that as calling somebody's baby ugly. You always instinctively rush to protect what you define as yours. It doesn't matter whether that's something completely arbitrary or something deeply meaningful. We all rally to protect the things that we identify with. So that makes challenging other people's bias particularly irksome. My preferred strategy to avoid raising other people's hackles is to ask questions, to try to lead them on the path that I found myself going down, questioning their data. That it's not foolproof. There's probably no one single answer, but the better you can be at challenging your own bias, the more likely you are to find a productive inroad to challenge someone else's bias. But just remember, the worst way to go about it is to simply say, that's bad, that's dumb, I don't think that's right. Any of those comments, even if they're made in jest, those comments are likely to shut people down. But a question, especially one that can't be answered as a simple yes or no, a question that gets them talking, that gets them asking their own questions, that's likely to open them up. And you can pretty quickly tell in most situations whether people are going to be open to understanding their bias. But ultimately, you will almost never get someone to admit to you in the moment that they're wrong. That's just not something you can count on happening. While it does happen, it happens so rarely that it's hardly worth considering. Don't expect to get someone to contradict themselves and backtrack willingly, but rather give them the space to evaluate something, and you might call it saving face. Give them a good out to pull their data back and reevaluate, and let them question their biases on their own time, on their own terms, and come back to you later.
Thanks, Matthew. So we'll just take one more question here before we tune out. This question is, I am a content creator. I also produce reports for my superiors. They often want detail and a lot of it. How can I make a detail-heavy dashboard legible and actionable, like you say?
Great question. As somebody who's been in those analytical shoes on many occasions, I understand that a lot of people who are data consumers have very specific ideas about what they're going to do with that information, and they're not necessarily going to tell you how they're going to get there. And that provides a big challenge for us as content creators. My preferred solution is to start off with a clean, minimalist dashboard, much like the good item in my demonstration today. Something with very top-level, unlabeled or minimally labeled visuals. And then I will support that with more detailed graphics. A view like that minimalist dashboard is really intended for people to glance at it and within 5-10 seconds understand, oh, this is high, that's low, this is increasing, that's decreasing, and that's all. You're not telling them by how much or what action to take at that point. That's simply to say, this is our top level, and then you have supporting documentation. Your supporting documentation goes into that pithy detail. At all costs, resist the urge to pack that first visual with all the possible details they might need. If you pack all the possible details they might need right in the front, you will create a solid block of almost impenetrable information, and people will not trickle further into your document. If you want them to follow, give them something in the front that makes them ask questions, that piques their interest, and then lead them further into your document. And that will lead them into your own path, your journey, the story that you want to tell.
Thank you, Matthew. So I think that's it for our questions. If anyone else comes up with a question after the webinar, you can always shoot us an email at team.ccms@ixiosoft.com and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great presentation.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Anytime. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday, April 21st at 11 a.m. And the presentation will focus on localization, featuring Dominique Truche he's the CEO at WHP, and Ixiosoft's own data specialist, Henrietta Taylor. So stay tuned for more details, and we will see you in April.